Hello, welcome to this lecture on postcolonialism for POL 102, International Politics, and also IRL 102, Introduction to International Relations. My name is Giorgio Shani. I am a professor of politics and international relations at International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. And this lecture is recorded on the 29th of January, 2024, specifically for students taking these courses. So previously in the course, we have looked at realism, liberalism, Marxism, and critical theory. And the question to start off with is something missing? Can conventional theories of international relations explain, for example, the following events which have taken place within the past couple of days? Looking at the news, the global news, not the national news, we'll see that one of the news items have been drone strikes, which have killed 3 US citizens, which have been attributed to Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are backed by Iran, who are allegedly backed by Iran. And then we have 2 different items which are related to the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza. The first is a ruling by the International Court of Justice, the highest UN court, on a case brought by the Republic of South Africa, accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. The ruling stopped short of finding Israel guilty. So Israel was not found guilty on the charges of genocide, but the court held it accountable for genocidal acts committed by IDF forces in Gaza. Secondly, and related to this, or perhaps possibly related to this, the decision of Western states, including not only the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, but also Japan, to pause aid to UNRWA, the United Nations agency which provides vital services, including health and education, to the people of Gaza. UNRWA staff have been vocal critics of the Israeli response to the October 7 attacks, which killed 1,250 people. And 12 have been recently allegedly implicated in those October 7 attacks. So what we found is that because of allegations brought against 12 members of UNRWA, the main donors to UNRWA have paused funding to the UN agency responsible for providing food, shelter, education, and health services to the people, not only of Gaza, but those within occupied Palestinian territory. And then finally, in another part of the world, we find an ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine following Russia's launching of a special military operation in February 2022. So we find that last week a Russian jet was shot down in Ukraine. A Russian jet carrying Ukrainian prisoners of war was shot down in Russian territory, allegedly by Ukraine. What do all of these news stories arguably have in common, or what is the missing link? From realists, liberal, Marxist and critical theory perspectives. There will be different explanations given to these conflicts, but from a post-colonial perspective, the missing link is the colonial legacy. The fact that the Middle East was a mandated territory, which was ruled by Britain and France after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire up to the Second World War. And it was during this period that the state of Israel was supported by the British and also the French. And it was also during this period that Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Beforehand, Ukraine was a colony of Russia. So most of these territories were colonized. So for post-colonial theorists, for people who take a post-colonial perspective, colonialism is alive and well in international relations, and we cannot understand international relations without understanding the formative role of colonialism in the evolution of the international system and the international system of sovereign states. Okay, so firstly, what does post-colonialism mean? Well, the post here refers to after, and post-colonialism can be seen as a historical period. So this historical period refers to the period, conventionally speaking, refers to the period after decolonization, after the achievement of political independence for the former territories of European empires. However, for post-colonial theorists, post-colonialism refers to the period after the onset of colonialism. So after the beginnings of European colonialism, which date back to the conquest of the Americas after the so-called discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492. So for post-colonialists, theorists, colonialism is still continuing. Post-colonialism questions whether decolonization, meaning freedom from colonial rule, brought about an end to colonialism and its associated ideas, including ideas such as development. So it can be seen as questioning conventional understandings of decolonization as freedom from colonial rule in the form of granting of sovereign statehood. It should be pointed out that perhaps the biggest change in the international system over the past 100 years has not been the end of the Second World War, although it precipitated this change, but was decolonization, in other words, the granting of sovereign statehood to former colonial territories. So if we look at the members of the League of Nations 100 years ago, we find that the majority of humanity were excluded from the League of Nations, whereas today we have more than 200 nation states. Post-colonialism seeks to resist imperialism and sees imperialism as continuing in cultural, economic, and political forms. So this resistance to imperialism, which has recently taken the form of decolonial thinking, which we will perhaps briefly touch upon. So this idea of resistance is maybe seen as normative. So the analytical focus of post-colonialism is to see explanations of contemporary events, such as the ones which I have outlined at the beginning of the lecture, in the colonial legacy, in the legacy of 500 years of European colonialism of the rest of the world. Whereas normatively, it seeks to resist this imperialism. There's a normative um, desire to decolonize. And furthermore, post-colonialism implicates academic disciplines in imperialism, and here contests the hegemony of Western thought, hegemony in the sense which I outlined in the lecture on critical theory when we looked at the work of Antonio Gramsci, who talked in terms of hegemony as being a function of both coercion and consent. So the idea is that the various academic disciplines, including and arguably especially international relations, are complicit in ongoing practices of imperialism. So international relations scholars, not just people like Henry Kissinger, the late Henry Kissinger, who was a realist scholar who became a national security advisor for the United States and played a key role in formulating US policy, but most international relations or policy experts are involved in these ongoing processes of imperialism by accepting work on media corporations or by accepting work formulating various policies. So in this sense, most of most academic disciplines, but particularly international relations, play a part in these ongoing processes of imperialism. Okay, now theoretically, post-colonialism draws on the work of many critical theorists and post-structuralist theorists such as Michel Foucault, seeing both knowledge and power as linked. So in the lecture on critical theory, we looked at the work of Robert Cox, who argued that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. Well, one way of looking at this is to say that theory in this sense for post-colonial theorists is usually for the hegemonic powers, hegemonic social forces, and its theories such as realism are there not only to reinforce and reproduce the hegemony of these social forces and dominant states and imperialist powers, but also to reinforce the hegemony of the ideas, of Western ideas. And it's this idea of resisting hegemony, resisting Western ideas, particularizing Western ideas, which is an important component of post-colonial and decolonial thought. And I will expand upon that later. In general, post-colonialism in international relations and in development is skeptical of Western efforts to save and speak for the subaltern. So the term subaltern was introduced in the work of Antonio Gramsci, who we covered in critical theory. So Gramsci talked in terms of subaltern classes. Gramsci was looking at Italy, and when he talked of these subaltern, marginalized, and oppressed classes, which were not the dominant or hegemonic classes. So it's opposed to the capitalist class. And also opposed to the proletariat. But the term subaltern has been used by post-colonial theorists, particularly by Gramscian influenced historians of South Asia and Latin America, who used the term subaltern to refer to the global South itself, to refer to marginalized and oppressed classes of people, usually in the global South, especially women. And we see a particularly influential approach in the work of Gayatri Spivak, who asked the question, can the subaltern speak? Spivak, like many post-colonial theorists, was influenced by post-structuralism, and particularly the work of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. I think Foucault is important because for Foucault, power is what creates knowledge. So there is no knowledge, there is no theory outside of power relations. Okay, then let's look at the genealogy or the history here of the development of post-colonial theory. Now, the first point to note is that the post-colonial theorists which we are going to isolate would not have considered themselves to be post-colonial theorists. And to be quite frank, they would be very different from the other theorists which we have focused on in the course. I think perhaps the first starting point would be in the work of Frantz Fanon, who was not an international relations theorist, nor was he a professional academic, nor a historian. He was in fact a psychiatrist and a writer, but born in the French colony of Martinique. So he was a passionate supporter of the anti-colonial struggles globally, and particularly of Algerian independence. So he fought for the Front Libération Nationale, the FLN, in the Algerian Civil War against the French. Now he was sent first to Algeria from France, where he studied psychiatry, and it was through the process of dealing with patients, mainly Arab patients within Algeria, that he realized the symptoms which they were suffering from were the symptoms of being colonized. So quite frankly, colonialism was a dehumanizing process. It robbed people of their dignity and of their self-respect. And it also, and this is where Frantz Fanon shares a lot in common with other progenitors of decolonial and post-colonial thought, such as Aimé Césaire. It also dehumanized the Europeans. So the Europeans who are fighting for democracy and human rights, such as the French in Europe against the Nazis, were using the same sort of atrocities, the same sort of techniques which the Nazis used against them in the colonies. So colonialism here was seen as a dehumanizing process in which both colonizer and in which the colonized were robbed of their humanity and of their dignity. And he felt this acutely due to his upbringing in Martinique and his background in psychiatry. He studied in one of the most influential places to study psychiatry in the world in its infancy. Fanon looks at the role which desire played in this. So in his seminal book, Black Skin, White Masks, he argued that the way colonialism operated and dehumanized people was through desire, through people within the colonies desiring to be like the colonized, the colonized desiring to be like their colonizers, taking on the same language, mannerisms, etc., and reproducing the same social hierarchies. So for Fanon, in his book, Black Skins, White Masks, the secret of colonization is not just in the force. It's not just in the political force of colonialism. It's not in the force of weapons, but it's also in mastery of language, what Michel Foucault, and later when I introduce you to on the next slide to Edward Said, would term discourse. So mastery of language affords remarkable power. language here can be seen both literally and also figuratively. So literally, after decolonization, so Fanon did not live to see Algeria become independent. He died very young in 1961 after publishing his seminal Les Damnés de Terre, The Wretched of the Earth, which was published in English in 1963. But Algeria becomes independent after his death. But they also adopt French as well as Arabic as the language, of the national language. And in many parts of Francophone Africa, which was not independent of French colonial rule in Fanon's lifetime, um, we see that French becomes the national language, just as English becomes the national language in Anglophone Africa. And most importantly, Western ideas of education, Western ideas of political organization, such as the sovereign state and the rule of law, become to define the new decolonized territories, the nation state. It's also important to note that Frantz Fanon was seen as a Marxist. So he was very much a Marxist, influenced by Marxism, but he made a break with Marxism because within Orthodox Marxism, the proletariat is always seen as the revolutionary class, the exploited revolutionary class. Whereas Fanon's argument, and this mirrors perhaps arguments which feminists have made, who also came from a Marxist tradition. Fanon said, no, it's the wretched of the earth, the oppressed of the earth, of feminists women, who can be seen as the revolutionary class, and they should overthrow not just the sovereign state, but challenge, contest the hegemony of imperialism, just as feminists would say that we should contest the hegemony of male domination, meaning which they term patriarchy. So Fanon, along with Antonio Gramsci, may be seen as progenitors of post-colonial thought, but they were not post-colonial thinkers. They were Marxist thinkers, but they influenced the development of post-colonial thought. So post-colonial thought only really develops with the seminal work of Edward Said, who, unlike Frantz Fanon and Antonio Gramsci, was not a revolutionary, he was not an activist, and he certainly was not a Marxist, but Said was a refugee. Although he was born in Cairo, he was born to Palestinian parents. He had to flee Palestine and became a refugee as a result of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and he had to leave his home. This is what Palestinians refer to as al-Nakba, the catastrophe, and he can never return to his childhood home. He could never return to Palestine. However, he had a very privileged upbringing in Beirut. He was, unlike the majority of Palestinians, but like Jesus, no, actually not like Jesus, but like the majority of Palestinians, unlike the majority of Palestinians, he was a Christian, and he would feel at home at the International Christian University. Well, not quite at home, but he would be at least certainly had been exposed to a liberal arts education policy. And he was educated in the United States at Harvard University and found an excellent job at Columbia University, where he became a professor of comparative literature. So he was a very privileged, he had a very, seemed to have a very privileged, successful career. However, the trauma in a way for Said of being a refugee and his attachment to his Palestinian identity never quite left him. and in as a literary theorist, specializing in French and English writing within the colonial period. He found that or became increasingly alienated. This is more of a Marxist understanding or term, alienated, but he felt alienated from the novels he was writing in the depiction of people from the same part of the world as him, as people who were fanatical, people who were irrational, um, and also people who were unable to govern themselves and needed, a firm hand, needed somebody else to govern them. So he felt this description within the novels by these European writers help create the um, framework for a naturalization or a legitimization of colonialism. In other words, made colonialism natural. So Said applied Michel Foucault's understanding of power knowledge, how knowledge is how power creates knowledge, to representations of the Orient in the novels which he was reading and within Western discourse, particularly media discourse, where he found that the same, what we will call tropes, the same depictions of people from the same part of the world, the same from the Middle East, were reproduced and are reproduced, arguably, in mainstream and social media accounts. So these accounts bordered here on racism. Now he termed this and christened this Orientalism. So Orientalism was a Western discourse used to represent the societies it then colonized. So what Said does is he doesn't really make a distinction between Britain and France, which were the colonial powers, and the United States of America in the late 20th century in which he lived. For Said, the United States was an imperial power. It intervened in the domestic affairs of the Middle East. It supported not only the establishment of the state of Israel, but it supported Israel in its attempts to drive away the Palestinian or displace the Palestinian population. Now, for Said, this was not Orientalism was not just confined to the Middle East, which, as Marxists would say, has oil reserves which make it important for to establish control of. But Orientalism could also be used to other parts of the world. So Orientalism is a Western discourse merely to represent society which it then colonizes or which it controls. So Said's arguments could work and have worked if we apply them even to Japan. So if we look at classical European literary depictions of the Japanese, what do we see? We see Japan as populated by samurai and geisha. These are seen as stereotypes, others. It's a way of othering Japan, saying they're very different from us. If we look at contemporary depictions of Japan and the way in which Japan was depicted during the late 1980s when it became arguably the world's successful economy and a competitor to the United States, then we saw very negative depictions of Japan as a different society, a society based on patriarchy, a society where you have yakuza and you have corruption, So these very negative stereotypes of Japan in mainstream media discourses also serve a political function. They're to other the Japan. They're to put Japan on the defensive and put Japanese people on the defensive, and also to naturalize the idea that the West is still the center of international relations, and Western ideas are natural. Western ideas are hegemonic, are universal. Arguably, we see the same thing happening vis-a-vis China, now that the People's Republic of China has become the world's second largest economy. Um, we have a revival of ideas of the People's Republic of China uh, as being a society which is authoritarian, which is almost despotic, just like the old sultans of the Middle East, and just like perhaps uh, Russia and the former Soviet Union, which has always had an ambivalent relationship here with the West. Now, the problem with Orientalism is that it homogenizes and essentializes all peoples and say, this is how they are. And therefore, this legitimizes and naturalizes interventions by the West. We have to do something about them. We have to support our allies. So we see this in the bombing of the Houthis. So these Houthi rebels, well, they are threatening Red Sea shipping routes. We need to bomb them. Who's we? The United States and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a former imperial power. So why are they involved in this bombing? Why are they involved in the protection of shipping routes? So these are all ways in which Orientalism impacts upon international relations. So let us turn then to post-colonialism and international relations. So post-colonialism implicated mainly disciplines such as literature, and it flourished in the humanities by critiquing anthropology. So anthropology was based on trying to understand the other. But what Said argued was that, the implications of Said's ideas was that understanding the other was a pretext to colonizing the other. And indeed, if we look at many anthropological texts, these have been work which have been carried out during periods of war or conflict in which people have gathered information, anthropologists have gathered information, which is then being used to rule and control the societies which they will, which their states will govern. So a good example of this would be a key text in Japanese cultural anthropology, one of the oldest texts in Japanese cultural anthropology by Ruth Benedict, called Kiku Tokana, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which is seen as a very essentialized understanding of Japanese culture, an introduction to Japanese culture, very stereotypical introduction to Japanese culture. Now, actually, Benedict, I don't think, went to Japan. She conducted and wrote this book during the Second World War, or fieldwork for the book during the Second World War, whilst interviewing Japanese prisoners of war. And this was at a period of time when the United States wanted to get as much information about Japan because they were fighting against Japan, and afterwards they occupied Japan. And during the occupation, it was Benedict's book was read by many of those who worked as part of the occupation. So from a post-colonial perspective, the occupation and the subsequent development of liberal democratic structures within Japan masks the fact that basically Japan is a colony of the United States, or in the terms, in Gavin McCormack's words, is a client state of the United States, even though Japan was a former colonial empire. So here this implicates the discipline of anthropology in the pursuit of power and in imperialism. Now, so how to sum up, or what are the impacts of post-colonialism and international relations? Well, for a long period of time, post-colonial ideas were not seen as part of international relations. This was certainly the case when I studied international relations. It's only really when I left to come to Japan that post-colonialism has now become established as a different approach in international relations. Mainly this was because there were very few post-colonial theorists working in international relations. Most people had to be realists or liberals. Marxists once upon a time could find positions in teach international relations. Then there became the critical theorists and constructivists then influenced or became established schools in international relations. But post-colonialism developed quite late within international relations, but has a lot to say about international relations. Firstly, it sees international relations as Eurocentric. Eurocentric here means based on generalization of the European experience. So basically for post-colonial theorists, the world is not Europe. The international system, the Westphalian system of sovereign states, this is a European international society. This is a European international system. This is founded on European ideas. This does not apply necessarily to the rest of the world, which has developed different understandings of political formation and political communities. Now, in contrast to realism, because post-colonialism shares in realism an understanding of the central value of power in international relations. But in contrast to realism, it sees international relations as hierarchical rather than anarchic. So if you note and recall the lecture on realism, we looked at Walz's theory of international politics, which interestingly was written around the same time as Edward Said's classic book, Orientalism within Literature. So within this theory of international politics, Walz mentions that the structure of the structure of the international system is anarchic, meaning the absence of a common power. Well, you know, for post-colonial theorists, no, this is just, it's not true at all. The international system has exhibited a high degree of continuity for the past 500 years. So there's a high degree of continuity between contemporary international relations and previous forms of imperialism. So if you go back 100 years or even 200 years, we would always find European or European-based powers or powers where the majority of the populations and the elites are European, being involved in conflicts within, let's say, the Middle East and East Asia. So in contrast to realism, it sees international relations as hierarchical, meaning based on imperialism. So we see this in the decision of, as previously mentioned, the decision not only of the United States, but of Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, Italy, Germany, and Japan, to pause their funding of the United Nations agency UNRWA, which provides services to Palestinians in the occupied territories, even though there are allegations, and these allegations need to be investigated. So this is a display of power. Basically, they're saying, look, we don't care about the United Nations, even though we set it up. We don't really care about international law. We're poisoning our funds, meaning you're not doing what we want you to do. Be less critical of our ally Israel's response to the attacks of October 7, 2023. Be more supportive of their attempts to destroy Hamas. Don't speak too much about, the 25,000 people who may have been killed in the response, and do not bring in allegations, perhaps, of genocide. So basically, this hierarchy here at the heart of international relations is important. Most of the societies in today's global south were formerly colonized societies. Now, that's the contrast here with realism, this rejection of anarchy. But it also, and realism, as we know, is an analytical theory. It focuses what is rather than what ought to be. But postcolonialism also rejects the universalism and the universal values of liberalism, Marxism, and critical theory, which it sees not as universal values, but which it sees as values which are particular to the West. Ideas such as democracy, ideas of human rights, and arguably even ideas of socialism and emancipation. And it seeks to, in the words of Dipesh Chakrabarti, provincialize Europe. By provincializing Europe, meaning showing that Europe, and Europe is the term given to the entire West here, to basically show that the West is just, the values of the West, the normative values of the West are not universal. They don't apply to everybody, but they were formulated in a particular time at a particular place in Western Europe or in the West, and they apply to those societies and should not apply to the rest of the world. Postcolonialism, importantly, highlights the violence that went with the expansion of international society. It's the term which Bull and Watson used to describe decolonization. So they call the historical period decolonization, where colonial territories became politically independent, as an expansion of international society, because instead of rejecting ideas such as sovereign statehood, diplomacy, and war, these states became members of the United Nations, and they accepted the rules of the game, the principles of international relations. But for post-colonial theorists, there was the violence that went into the expansion of international society was only possible because of the process of colonialism. And colonialism was inherently a violent process. This is perhaps the break here with Gramscian ideas of hegemony. So their argument is that colonialism was not hegemonic. It was about Europeans conquering other parts of the world and massacring indigenous populations and taking over their land. This happened in the Americas, it happened in Australia, it happened in Asia, and it happened in Africa as well. So basically, it highlights the violence that went into creating a international system based on Western hegemony and values. Okay, now let's look at our case study. Let's look at the case study which we used for critical theory, and arguably it can apply now. which looks at Orientalism and the war on terror. So we're looking at how representations of the Orient, of the Middle East, make possible imperialism, make imperialism possible. So if we look at war on terror, then we'll see that many post-colonial theorists, and remember, the war on terror is important because this is when post-colonial theorists started to engage within international relations and started to be accepted in international relations. The war on terror is an example of a discourse based on Orientalist assumptions. So remember, if we look at realism, we have a world divided into sovereign states. Liberals say there's a world divided into rational individual human beings. Marxists would say there's a world divided into classes. But if we look at the discourse on the war on terror, we find that this is this unending war against a particular concept of terrorism. This is not extremist sort of terrorism, which is associated with the rise of militant white nationalism in many parts of the world. This is specifically Islamic terrorism and Islamic terrorism in the Middle East, which necessitated the argument intervention by the United States and its allies in the Middle East and in Central Asia, the occupation specifically, the invasions and occupation specifically of Afghanistan, which had, upon which the United States based their decision on the right of self-defense, which is being used by Israel with arguably, as much or if not more justification in the invasion, non-invasion, but continued occupation and bombing of Gaza. And is also seen as part of the war on terror, is also seen as this unending war. It's a war without end. It was also used in Iraq. So it was the pretext for the occupation and invasion of Iraq, even though Iraq, as we discussed in class, had nothing to do with the terrorist attacks of 9/11, September 11, 2001, the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. So the argument here was this is not really about weapons of mass destruction. This isn't about democracy and human rights, but there's a certain logic of the war on terror, this unending war against Islamic extremism. And it's an example of a discourse based on Orientalist assumptions. So these include the existence of separate hierarchical civilizations, the West and Islam. So the West refers to geographical spaces in Europe, the United States, which was attacked on September 11, 2001, and also, can be applied to Australia. Arguably, it can be applied to Japan. In Japan, Japanese people like to apply it to Japan, and sometimes Japan is included within the West, even though it's in the East. But usually Japan is excluded from the concept of the West, even though they're a developed liberal democracy. Versus the Islamic world. So the Islamic world here is homogenized. So states with which practice very different traditions, such as the Shia and Sunni populations. For example, in Iran and Iraq, which fought a war in the 1980s in which 1 million people died, these are lumped together as part of an Islamic world. So the Islam here, 1 billion people are basically homogenized. These civilizations are seen as hierarchical. So the idea is that the West has democracy and human rights. And the problem with the Islamic world is particularly some areas of the Islamic parts of the Islamic world have now got a lot of oil wealth. They're very rich and prosperous, but they haven't developed liberal democratic structures. They don't respect the rights um, of individual human beings, and particularly women. Therefore, it is necessary to intervene in those societies. Closely related to this is this need to defend modern universal values, i.e. democracy, human rights, from Oriental despotism. So what does Saddam Hussein and the Taliban and Hamas have in common? Well, they're all seen as despotic, meaning they are tyrannical rulers. They are not, humane. They do not respect the rights of women. They're intrinsically not democratic. Because they're Oriental, they are not democratic. They don't understand what it is to be a democracy, whereas whoever we do. And allied to this is the need to protect the vulnerable groups. So, i.e. mainly women and children. It's usually always women and children from despots and terrorists such as Saddam Hussein, Saddam Hussein, who was the tyrant, the despotic ruler of Iraq, the Taliban, who are very different from Saddam Hussein, and arguably Hamas. So the need to destroy these groups. ISIS as well would be another example of a group. So it doesn't really matter what the group is, whether it's Saddam Hussein, Taliban, Hamas, ISIS, but there is a problem with Islamic terrorism. There's a problem with fanaticism. And in order to fix this problem, whoever we are, but usually it's the United States and other imperial partners, such as their junior partner, Britain and France, needs to occupy them. They don't formally colonize them, but they occupy them and they start disseminating their ideas about democracy and human rights whilst taking away their oil wealth in the case of Iraq. And this is also couched in the need to protect these vulnerable groups. So, if we look at the decision to occupy and invade Afghanistan after 2001, it wasn't initially to, protect the rights of women. It was initially to find Al-Qaeda, but the Al-Qaeda leadership had gone to Pakistan, which was actually an ally. But why did the United States stay for 20 years? Well, one of the reasons of why it stayed is that it stayed because it needed to protect the native populations, and particularly women and children, from the Taliban. The Taliban were seen as tyrannical. They were seen as despotic because they did and don't still give the rights of women and to go to school, of girls to go to school. And indeed, today, this is used as a rationale to pause aid to Afghanistan, even though Afghanistan is one of the world's poorest societies and has experienced severe hunger shortages. So this is seen to be a result of the Taliban's rules. Without the Taliban, there'll be a lot of aid and people would be able to eat, but and go to school. But with the Taliban, there is a pause in aid. So this shows how imperialism continues. Interestingly, Afghanistan is one of the few societies which was never colonized. The Russians and the British attempted to colonize Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union invaded, and now the United States occupied it and then left. But it's still the international community, meaning the powerful Western powers, continue to intervene in its internal affairs. Okay, so by way of conclusion, postcolonialism seeks to contest Western hegemony. So particularly the hegemony of Western ideas is reproduced through representation of the rest, meaning post-colonial developing societies. So we see this in mainstream media depictions, not only within the West, but in many societies of whole parts of the world as developing, as needing our aid, needing our infrastructure, um, and needing our assistance, needing our help. Um, the focus is on resistance. This is the normative, uh, the normative. This is the normative dimension of post-colonialism. So instead of just accepting that the international system is based on imperialism and colonialism, the focus is on resisting it, resisting not only political imperialism, but also the imperialism of ideas, its discourses, countering its discourses, its depiction of people. So focus on resistance to imperialism and its discourses, which is still continuing. So colonialism, as in the annexation of one society by another society, may no longer be permissible under international law, certainly since the UN General Assembly Declaration in 1960, 1514, which gave states a right to freedom. However, even though states are free, are politically free, politically, economically, and culturally, they are still controlled by Western states or by hegemonic states. And international relations is based on these assumptions, on Western assumptions of how international relations should be run, or how, or what the international system should look like. So whenever you hear the international community, well, the international community doesn't exist. It's not a community. It's basically a club. It's a club of imperial powers, great powers, and now China is sort of joining those powers, perhaps. But the idea is that it's basically the same club as existed over 100 years ago. It's the imperial powers, mainly European powers. Now, in the words of Ashish Nandi, who's a post-colonial theorist who is not interested in international relations, he's like Fanon, he's a psychologist or a psychoanalyst, and he came to International Christian University to give a keynote as part of a Rethinking Peace Studies project, and contributed a chapter to a book I edited on rethinking peace. For Ashish Nandi, the objective is not just political freedom. It's not just political decolonization from European rule, as India achieved in 1947, as well as Pakistan, but the decolonization of the mind. So countering this desire to be like the colonizer. So that is the beginnings here, perhaps, of decolonial thought. So this process, active process of decolonizing, means contesting the hegemony of Western ideas. And in this, I would argue that Nandi echoes the work which his compatriot Rabindranath Tagore, work which Rabindranath Tagore did in a lecture in Japan 100 years ago, when he was invited to give lectures on nationalism, when he gave a lecture on Japan. And he said that in a very flattering portrait, which could be seen as Orientalist, of Japan, he said, Japan should not try and be like the West. It should be itself. And I think his words were particularly prescient because 20 years later, Japan launched the Second World War. This was during the time of Japan's colonization of Korea, and Japan had defeated Russia in the 1905 war. And even though Japan was a power in its own right. It wanted acceptance from the West. And the only way to get acceptance from the West was to act as a colonial power. And this led eventually to the Second World War and to occupation. So for some post-colonial theorists, Japan is basically remains after the Second World War a colony, not in name, but a client state of the United States. Okay, by way of discussion, on Thursday, we will look at the question on what would a post-colonial view of the Israel-Gaza conflict be. So we've looked at Orientalism and the war on terror. How can we apply this to the study of the contemporary of the contemporary conflict happening now in Israel and Gaza. So if we go through the key events, which I'll go through in class, they include during the mandated, during the time, well, actually just in the aftermath of the First World War, during the First World War, when Palestine was part of the Ottoman Caliphate. We had the Britain and France already decided that they would take over the territories and deny freedom to the various Arab peoples within the Ottoman-controlled territories. We had the Balfour Declaration by Lord Balfour, who was the British Home Secretary at the time, who argued that Britain should encourage Jewish emigration from Europe to create a homeland in British mandated Palestine. In 1948, we have the creation of the State of Israel and also the Al-Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians. In 1948, 56, 67, and 73, we had the Arab-Israeli wars where basically Arab states declared war on Israel in the name of the Palestinians. They were defeated in most of the cases, though in 1973 it was more of a draw. But the West supported Israel in this. In the 1993, we have the Oslo Peace Accords, and in the Oslo Peace Accords, we find belated recognition of the State of Israel by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. However, the peace accords also committed the region and the world to the creation of a Palestinian statehood, which still hasn't happened. In part, this could be argued that this was a result of the victory of Hamas, which is the Muslim Brotherhood resistance. It's an acronym for the Muslim Brotherhood Resistance Organization, which won the elections held in Gaza in 2006. This precipitated Israel to launch a blockade of Gaza to control what went in and what went out of Gaza, and meant that Gaza could never really become politically independent. And then in 2023, we find the October 7 Hamas attacks, where 1,250 people are killed as a result of these horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas. And this precipitates an Israeli response, which has killed 25,000 people and counting as of today, and displaced 1.7 million people. This has given rise to allegations of genocide, which were brought to the International Court of Justice by South Africa. And we find the ICJ ruling only on last Friday, which argues that Israel has not been seen as guilty of genocide, but IDF need to do more to prevent genocidal acts being committed as part of their war against Hamas. Okay, now in terms of further reading, if you have time, I would argue that you should read the two classic works um, which have influenced the development of post-colonial thought. Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Les Damnés de Terre. This is not an academic text, it's an impassioned text by Fanon. It echoes the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx. So he's saying that the wretched of the world should unite, just as Marx mentioned that the um, workers of the world should unite. And Edward Said's Orientalism. So this is Orientalism is more of an academic book, but it looks at the development of Orientalist discourse and the depictions of the people in the Middle East and how this is seen as part of um, ongoing Western attempts to subjugate the Middle East. Then there are two book chapters, one by Siba Gravogi, who's president of the International Studies Association, his contribution to Dunn, Kirky, and Smith International Relations Theory. And finally, my forthcoming chapter in Devetak and McCarthy's An Introduction to International Relations, which I have uploaded to Moodle. Okay, thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.